You're listening to Patriot Radio New Orleans by way of Wisconsin. We're going to route out these pretenders in the JFK community one at a time. And tonight we're going to focus our sights on Lisa Pease. Let's beam up the good doctor and let's join a conversation already in progress. It is live. It is not Memorex. Pretenders. And we seem to have, well, it seems 9 out of 10 in the JFK community just maybe working for the other side. So we're going to focus our sights on Lisa Pease tonight. Are you ready to do it, Dr. Fetzer?
Let's go for it, Gary. I'm just shocked that Gordon Duff could be correct when he told me that my estimate of 50% working the other side was wrong, and that it was actually 90.
Yeah, I wish he'd be wrong. As we're routing these people out, it's okay if we're wrong. We actually want to be, believe it or not. Hi, Dr. Fetzer. In one of my earlier Patriot Radio shows, when I was doing WGSO in New Orleans on 690 AM, every year I would go to Dealey Plaza and I would gather interviews from the different researchers that were there, and I came upon Lisa Pease. And it just seemed to me that when you realize that Edward Lansdale is in Dealey Plaza, that almost explains everything, and it's almost all you need to know. So I was very, very surprised to hear her comment when I asked her, don't you think that Edward Lansdale being in Dealey Plaza says it all? And here's what we have.
In my mind, there's a lot to look at, but as soon as you know that, you pretty much know everything, and it pretty much closes the case to me. What's your view on Edward Lansdale?
Well, actually, I would disagree. First, I'm not convinced. But I'm not convinced that Lansdale was behind the plot. He was not in the inner circle of the people who are surrounding Oswald in the files. There was a falling out between Lansdale and the CIA.
I'm not convinced that Edward Lansdale was even here, even though my hero Fletcher Prouty says he was here. All right, go ahead.
Well, like I said, I wouldn't know Lansdale the way Fletcher Prouty was, so maybe he was here in the plaza, but if he was, I don't think he was running the plot. I don't think that would be his purpose here.
You have seen the photographs where you can see the back of his head and the ring.
I've seen the supposed Masonic hand sign. I mean, I've seen all that. I'm just not persuaded.
Still not 100%.
I'm much more interested in the really solid evidence, the stuff that we have that's self-incriminating.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, what do you think about that one?
Well, she's trading on an ambiguity. She's saying she doesn't think he was responsible for the plot, but no one's implying that. Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar appear to have been the pivotal players. I've explained before you have to distinguish between the sponsors, those who wanted JFK out and Lyndon in for reasons of policy, apart from the anti-Castro Cubans, who wanted to kill Kennedy as a form of revenge for having betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs, which was their belief, nurtured by the CIA. So you got the CIA, the Texas oil men, the Eastern establishment around the Fed, the Joint Chiefs, the Mafia, Israel, all among the sponsors. Then at the bottom, you have the mechanics, those who were responsible, the shooters or supervisors and coordinators. And we know, I have explained my conclusions about the shooters, a Dallas deputy sheriff, an Air Force expert, a Dallas police officer, an anti-Castro Cuban, a guy who worked for the mob, Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman. Those appear to have been the shooters. But they were supervised and coordinated, and it appears to have been by General Edward Lansdale, responsible for assassinations all over the world, and George Herbert Walker Bush. A very important article about this was authored by Richard Hook, entitled, Did George H.W. Bush Coordinate a JFK Hit Team? To which the answer appears to be a resounding yes. And I gather more recently that Lisa Pease has even denied the identity of the man in the photograph walking past the three tramps. If you have that clip, Gary, let's talk about that too.
All right, we'll play that one right now.
Anyway, the only way we can stop all this is to educate each other, realize that conspiracies are a part of life, be suspicious, but look for facts. Meaning, I get really upset when I hear people saying, the Sandy shooting was just a bunch of actors and no one really died there. It's like, well, tell that to the parents. Please, don't tell that to the parents. There are people who really lost their children there. And to claim that was just an act and a conspiracy of that kind is so irrational and immoral, it's really appalling. And if you have a question about it, great, look into it, but then deal with the facts that you find. Deal with the fact that there were really dead children and dead people, that was not just a show staged event. Similarly with 9/11, some of the story is bullshit, but some of the facts are really disturbing. I mean, there really is no good explanation for Building 7 going down, except by a controlled demolition. And if that's the case, what about the rest of the story isn't true? I don't know, haven't looked into it, don't have time, I can't follow every weird thing that happens in America. But again, be smart about it. Don't just say everything's a conspiracy, because not everything is. Don't disbelieve everybody, just because some people are unbelievable.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, how much looking do you have to do into Building 7? And as far as Sandy Hook, if you don't have time to look into it, then you should be listening to The Real Deal, because we put our homework in, and I'm actually speaking for you, Dr. Fetzer. Go ahead.
Gary, this is embarrassing. I mean, does Lisa Pease not even understand 9/11 was an inside job involving collusion between the CIA, the Mossad, and the neocons in the Department of Defense? Building 7 is one of the most stunning indications, because the manner in which it is destroyed is completely inconsistent with the manner in which Buildings 1 and 2, the North and the South Tower, were destroyed. JFK.
All right, well, let's let Fletcher Power to give her a little lesson here on Edward Lansdale being in Dealey Plaza or not, because she seems to be neutral, that's the word.
In addition to the 2 policemen and the 3 tramps, as they're called, is another man, and he's walking in the other direction. But the thing about it is, so that his back is more or less to, or his side and his back is more or less to the photographer rather than face forward. Here's this man in a business suit, just as casually walking along. He doesn't even turn, he's not looking at anybody, just walking past, and he happens to be standing by these men as they're being marched. This man's looking at nobody. And I recognized immediately that that man is General Lansdale. Now, Lansdale is a very interesting figure in the Kennedy era. And I know Lansdale. I worked with him off and on from about 1952 to 1963. So he retired. Now, this is interesting. He retired from the Air Force on October 31st, 1963. Well, of course, the picture could have been 100 other people, and I could be wrong, but I know him very well. In other words, was Lansdale walking down right in front of the school book depository building to sort of reassure some people here, maybe his employees or somebody that's working for him? What's the significance of that? Well, of course, that happened to be my own interpretation. The men who had brought the pictures to me hadn't the slightest idea who it was, and I decided at that moment that what was needed next was a lot of research. So I got some very clear copies of those professional pictures. These pictures were taken by a professional news cameraman. I got a clear picture. And I started mailing the picture to acquaintances of mine and acquaintances of Lansdale who knew him without any of my thoughts. I simply would send the picture and say, can you tell me what this looks like to you? This was taken shortly after the death of the president, and I wonder if this picture calls anything to mind to you. You'd be amazed to find that from senior people in the government, such as Lansdale was or such as I was at the time, I got immediate confirmation. That said Lansdale. Well, now, I don't know why he was in Dallas. I can't go into that. But it's astounding that this man, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations after General Graves Erskine retired, who was the man who had more or less almost single-handedly set up Diem as president of South Vietnam, who again almost single-handedly had set up President McSai as president of the Philippines, who was considered probably the most significant person in the U.S. military, U.S. government on the subject of counterinsurgency, civic action, special forces, Green Beret troops. He had written the books that the Green Berets used in their courses down at Fort Bragg. What could have been his role at that time? I had a very personal interest in that because only a month or two before that, Lansdale had met me in the halls of the Pentagon and said that he had arranged for me to go as a military escort officer with a VIP party to the South Pole. And it happened that I left for the South Pole on about November 10th or something like that, and that I was in New Zealand on the way back from the South Pole when I heard about President Kennedy being killed. Why Lansdale asked me to go to the South Pole, I have no idea. Or was there some connection between this role that he may have been playing in Dallas and the fact that he would just as soon I be out of town? And I reflected on that, especially when I began to realize that almost all of Kennedy's cabinet was out of town, that some 45 officials with the cabinet were also out of town in Honolulu and on their way to Tokyo. They were actually on their way to Tokyo when the president was killed. And over the years I have made a study of how many people central to the inner workings of the secret government of this country had been moved out of Washington at that time. It's a very, very interesting subject. I wish I could answer it. I don't know how to answer it. I'm sure the picture is Lansdale. Others are sure it's Lansdale, and I have to leave it there.
Colonel Fletcher Prouty and General Victor Krulak both worked with General Edward Lansdale in the Pentagon. Both men identify him being in Dealey Plaza November 22, 1963. General Lansdale specialized in political psychological warfare operations and manipulation of governments. He worked for Allen Dulles, the Director of Central Intelligence. Although his cover story title was Air Force Colonel and later General, he was always working for the CIA. The photo of him reveals deep involvement with certain members of the CIA in the planning, removal, cover story, and cover-up of the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas on November 22, 1963.
Edward Lansdale in Dealey Plaza. Well, Lisa Pease seems to be neutral. Can't really make up her mind about that one.
Well, what dumbfounds me, Gary, is that Lisa Pease is making these observations on Black Op Radio, which, of course, is hosted by Leno Sanik, who was a student of Fletcher Prouty, who has been maintaining his archives, who knows very well that Fletcher was emphatic about the identity of this individual as having been Edward Lansdale, which, as the commentator observes, was also confirmed by Victor Krulak, one of the most celebrated Marine Corps generals in the entire history of the Corps. So there really isn't any doubt about who this was. He had a very distinguished left hand. He had a distinctive ring. He had a distinctive gait. And, of course, the height and the weight and all that fit Lansdale. These people are nobody's fool. And the very idea that Lisa Pease could be expressing doubt or skepticism or uncertainty about the identification tells me she's completely incompetent when it comes to JFK research. And I'm further dumbfounded that Leno Sanik would allow this to pass without correction, Gary. This is a very bad sign of the level of deterioration of Black Op Radio with Leno Sanik.
It seems like anybody can go in there and say anything they want except us.
Gary, it's embarrassing, too, because, you have this combination of Seamus Coogan and Jim Eugenio attacking Phil Nelson, attacking John Hankey, attacking Peter Janney, attacking me, and we're all contributing to the understanding that some very prominent political figures, including, of course, JFK's successor to be Lyndon Johnson, were pivotal players in the assassination. No one in the world, with a possible exception of Robert Caro, has done more research on Lyndon Johnson, and Caro wimped out when it came to the assassination. He built a brilliant case for the ruthless, aggressive nature of Lyndon Johnson, a man who had no scruples, who would stop at nothing to advance his own career. And then when it comes to the assassination, he really is muted and unable to speak the truth about the assassination. Enter Phil Nelson, who has done this brilliant work, LBJ, mastermind of JFK's assassination, where the word mastermind should be understood to mean pivotal player, to mean the key facilitator, the guy who was the coordinator between the sponsors and the actual mechanics, including Edward Lansdale. Go back to what E. Howard Hunt told his son St. John when he believed he was about to expire, namely that the chain of command went from Lyndon Johnson to Cord Meyer to David Atlee Phillips to William Harvey to David Sanchez Morales, but below them were the mechanics. So when Lisa Pease says she doesn't think he would have planned it, there's an ambiguity there. He undoubtedly planned the sequence of shots and the locations of the shooters. Of that I have no doubt. He did not plan or initiate the assassination, generally speaking, which originated with Lyndon Johnson when he forced his way onto the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960 by threatening to expose that JFK had had dalliances with beautiful women who were East German spies, that he suffered from Addison's disease and was not expected to live a long, healthy life, and Bobby, that if he were not on the ticket, and any proposal from the White House would be dead on arrival, because in his powerful position as Senate Majority Leader, he would kill them, which left Bobby and Jack in a dilemma. Jack had already extended the invitation to be his running mate to Stuart Symington in Missouri, but given him the night to think it over. And here Jack had to rescind that invitation. I'm quite sure the only time in his entire political career that he had to undertake such an action, all because of Lyndon Johnson, who was anticipating taking Jack out in order for him to accede to the presidency. And as many of us are aware, the very day of the assassination, 22 November 1963, there was to be a vote in the Senate on the Bobby Baker scandal, widely expected, who had been Lyndon's bankman in the Senate, widely expected to so tarnish Lyndon that he couldn't run again with JFK. JFK had already told Evelyn Lincoln, his personal secretary, that he wasn't going to run again with Lyndon, and suggested Terry Sanford. He was thinking about running with Terry Sanford. And even Richard Nixon, who'd been in Dallas for the ratification meeting at Noel Murchison Sr. the night before, was quoted in the Dallas Morning News that day as saying he did not think JFK would run with LBJ again. I mean, it was Lyndon's last chance. There appears to have been a three-part plan to take him out at Dealey Plaza, if not then at the Trademark, if not then on the Lyndon Johnson Ranch. Clearly the least desirable, but also the most certain to be able to have access to the target. They succeeded in Dealey Plaza, and Plan B and Plan C were unnecessary. But Edward Lansdale played a crucial role in making this come to pass. And to me, it's astounding and acutely disappointing that individuals such as Lisa Pease, Jim DiEugenio, Seamus Coogan are discrediting the citizens' investigation for truth about Kennedy assassination. Sitka, they're making it into a shambles, destroying its reputation, and discrediting some of the most serious students of the assassination that have ever come to pass, who were coincidentally speakers at the Santa Barbara conference on the 50th observance, JFK, the assassination of America.
You're listening to Patriot Radio New Orleans by way of Wisconsin. This is the new JFK show, and we're excited about it, so stand by. All right, we're going to continue on with our expose on Lisa Pease, and we'll get into some fake news and some very elementary numerology in our newscast. Stand by.
Sitka, they're making it into a shambles, destroying its reputation, and discrediting some of the most serious students of the assassination that have ever come to pass, who were coincidentally speakers at the Santa Barbara conference on the 50th observance, JFK, the assassination of America, part 1 of 6. And I know you're also working on John Hankey, and there are therefore 4 altogether to go with a 6 in total. I'm very glad you're doing this, Gary. You do a great job of it.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I have a 2-part question about that. All right, it seems to me that Mr. Osanek loves to have authors who have a different take on his show. Mainly it's authors who come in and they talk about their books. Two-part question here. Why has not Phil Nelson, Peter Janney, Ralph Sinkay, John Hankey, and if you do buy the disc set with all the shows from Black Op, Mr. Hankey's one is not there. They say technical difficulties, but I'm sure we could work that out. Now, secondly, if Mr. Osanek and Black Op Radio were to have Peter Janney, Phil Nelson, Ralph Sinkay, John Hankey, on just like any other author to talk about their book, would that go a long way to mending fences around here?
Well, of course, Gary. I mean, Leno Sanek is allowing people like Robert Groden to come on and casually make an aside about the alteration of the Zapruder film being a fairy tale, on a par with William Greer having shot JFK being a fairy tale, on a par with Oswald in the doorway being a fairy tale. I agree that Greer did not shoot JFK, which is provable on the basis of ballistics. Since Greer was to the left front and JFK to the right rear, if Greer had shot JFK, his brains would have been blown out to the right rear. Instead, they were blown out to the left rear. Therefore, Greer did not shoot JFK, but there's a mountain of evidence, which we've discussed many, many times, and where about the fabrication of the Zapruder film, and that the man in the doorway was, in fact, Lee Oswald. And to me, it's still dumbfounding that Leno Sanek did not include those two in his 50 points about JFK, because they're overwhelmingly more important than the vast majority of those he actually did include. Overwhelmingly more important. We're talking here about two of the very most important discoveries in the history of JFK assassination, but they weren't good enough for Leno Sanek to include in his 50 points for 50 years. To me, Gary, that is shocking and disgraceful and discredits Leno Sanek.
Why have Mr. Nelson, Mr. Janney, and basically the whole crew that was in Santa Barbara, why are they not allowed on the show? Have they been denied being on the show? Have they asked to be on the show? What's the story?
Gary, I can't say the latest. I do believe that, it's obvious that they ought to be featured as guests on Black Op Radio. I can't recall the latest communication I had with Len about any of this, but I'm certainly glad to write to him again, though I suspect he's just discarding my email.
Now, he said your email is blocked.
He said my email is blocked.
He said that on
But it's simply outrageous, you see, simply outrageous. Given all the years I gave to Black Op Radio, how supportive I've been of Leno Sanek in the past, now when I go through his 50 points and discover how, uneven they are, and now in some instances they're even outrageous, such as Robert Groden claiming that critics of the authenticity of the Zapruder film just don't know what they're talking about, because all the claims that have been made are easily answered, even though he doesn't answer even one of them, Gary. This is, he talks about lows in JFK research. I'm sorry to say, but his featuring Robert Groden about these issues is as low as it gets in JFK research. That's scraping the bottom of the barrel.
Let's go on with Lisa Pease. We've got one more clip. This is about George Bush being in Dealey Plaza. That was one of the questions I presented to her. So, everyone, these are highly exclusive clips. You'll hear them nowhere but in Gary King's little cassette file.
All right, next quick question. All right, was George Bush Sr. in Dealey Plaza that day?
Oh, I don't think so. I've seen that photo. I'm not persuaded. I don't think George Bush Sr. was involved in the plot, and I really looked into that. When his name first surfaced, I thought, wow, that would be interesting.
Secrets of the Family Secrets? Have you read that?
Yeah, I heard Russ Baker speak the other day, and again, I'm not persuaded. There's really solid evidence in some areas, and there's really flimsy evidence in areas, and the areas that interest me are the ones where we have the most solid evidence, where we have the CIA provably lying about Oswald, a month before the assassination, where we have Richard Helms going into the White House, trying to persuade Kennedy to invade Cuba because of a weapons cache found in the last month of JFK's life. There's a special that's going to be on TV tonight that's going to purport that Kennedy was planning this major invasion of Cuba, which is simply not true, because if he did, Helms would have been able to persuade him, because supposedly a Cuban's weapons cache was found in Venezuela. If Kennedy wanted to invade Cuba, that was his big opportunity. Instead, later that day, Helms ends up asking for an autographed photo of the president he can't stand. And this is 3 days before Kennedy is killed.
Wow.
All right, Dr. Professor, what do you think about George Bush and Dealey Plaza and Lisa Pease not being persuaded, but, a mountain of evidence by Fletcher Prouty and other high-ranking officials doesn't seem to be enough to persuade her either? What do you think?
Well, degrees of persuasion or conviction are subjective measures of the degree of belief you have in a given proposition. That is a separate question from the objective evidence that substantiates the position. Individuals who are rational should have subjective degrees of belief that are very close approximation to the objective strength of evidence. we have not only the photograph of George H.W. Bush standing in front of the book depository, we have the report of a man being arrested coming out of the Daltex building who described himself as an independent Houston oil man. We have the photographs of Edward Lansdale walking past the three tramps. We have another photograph of Edward Lansdale waiting to speak to George Herbert Walker Bush. We have the flimsy alibi of George Herbert Walker Bush and his fabricated phone call about this fellow named Parrott trying to show that he's going to contribute, to solving the case when he himself was deeply implicated in it. He appears to have been supervising the anti-Castro-Cuban Nestor Tony Escadro in the Daltex, from which 3 shots, the only unsilenced shots, were fired with a Mannlicher Carcano, where it's a reflection of the unreliability of the weapon, that there were 2 misses with only 1 hit after the driver, William Gurr, brought the limousine to a halt to make sure JFK would be killed. One of those misses hitting a curbing and injuring the distant bystander, James Tague. The other hitting the chrome strip above the windshield. But we can also go back to the CIA memorandum about George Bush being briefed on the Bay of Pigs invasion. 2 of the ships were rechristened just before the invasion. One was renamed Houston, the other Barbara. And the whole operation was known as Operation Zapata, which just happened to be the name of the Bush family oil drilling business. I'm convinced that if it had been a success, that Zapata would have the concession to drill all over the Caribbean basin. In my opinion, Lisa Pease's subjective degree of conviction is quite distinct from and opposite of the objective strength of the evidence here that George Herbert Walker Bush was involved in the assassination. And it appears to be part and parcel of the global stance of the Sitka people, meaning Jim Eugenio, Seamus Coogan, and Lisa Pease, that they want to deflect attention from some of the most important players in the assassination, including George Herbert Walker Bush, including Lyndon Johnson, including Richard Nixon, and blame it all on Allen Dulles, who undoubtedly was a player here, but where the others were far more important in moving forward with the assassination, and where George H.W. Bush even appears, as Richard Hook has very powerfully contended.